Back to 2 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to look at what Paul wrote and what we have as verse 10 and following. He gives a very dark picture of what was happening. And I'll come back to the idea that I think he was talking about what was happening within the church. There's not society at large. Although what happens in the church is both an expression, or can be, I think often is, both an expression of what's happening in the broader culture, and it is an influence upon the broader culture, often in the sense that it removes the rightful influence of God's design in the culture. Okay. And one of the last things he says is, hey, these men, these teachers will be exposed. He says, they're not going to get very far. They will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, again, back to the Jewish tradition of Jannes and Jambres, who opposed Moses, while they were as the Jewish tradition holds, they were the primary magicians in Pharaoh's court, Ramses II. And they opposed Moses when Moses confronted Pharisee with "let my people go." All right, now he says their folly will be clear to everyone. Wow. And then it's as though, let's turn the coin over. You, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance. Those are positive qualities you know about my teaching. Probably no one was exposed to Paul's teaching as often and as thoroughly as Timothy. And I think maybe the second guy would have been Titus. And you have to throw in Barnabas initially, and then Silas after that, his traveling companion. But Timothy knew Paul's teaching. It's almost like Paul is saying, you already know what I teach. It's not going to change, so you've got that. And then he says, my way of life. What was Paul's way of life? Well, let's think about it. First of all, Paul's way of life was not quite homeless, but very transitory. He never stayed in any one particular place once he began his life and work of establishing churches in Asia Minor and in Far Eastern Europe, and on even into Central Europe. He would stay anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of years where he established these churches. But it's like he didn't have an address of permanent residency. So it's kind of nomadic in a sense. So that's a point that's worth us making sure we get, right? Because it's not like Paul, he would go. It's not like Debbie and I. We go out. We try to go 3 or 4 times a year out to support our Open Door Library staff, but we get to come home. We have a home to come home to. Paul didn't. So, in a sense, Paul's home was wherever he laid his head. That's a significant piece of his way of life. A second piece of his way of life was he was what today is often called bivocational. his primary vocation in the sense of his what he viewed as his primary work was to speak the gospel of Jesus into cultures, cities where either it had not ever been known before or it wasn't known well. I mean, he was a missionary, but he supported himself in two ways. Well, he was supported in two ways. One is he was a tent maker. What in the world? You know what? In 2022, if you're looking at tent making from what we understand, what we know, and that's like kind of a dying art, because I think all the tents are made by machines these days, right? And oh, by the way, once you get outside of the military use, then you have, recreational tent campers, but they're not like gazillions of them. In Paul's day, most families had tents because if they ever traveled, they would take their tent with them. And it's still this way in the Middle East. People live in tents. So if your tent had a rip in it, a tear in it, you would need to get it fixed. Who would do that was a tent maker. So I think he probably could have stayed reasonably busy in his tent making and repair business. Well, he met a couple of folks, Aquila and Priscilla, who were also tent makers and also happened to be outspoken followers of Jesus. So it's not like his tent making was that part of his life and his mission work was that part. I think they were overlapping and merging and interwoven. Now, there's another way that he was provided for, and that was through the gifts, the contributions of Christians. Talks to the Philippians about this, and he says he's grateful. In fact, he says, when I think of you, I'm just so thankful because of their generosity toward him. He talks about this also to the Colossian church. Well, I know what it's like to have a significant part of my income depending on the generosity of people. But you have to walk that back at least another step, in my opinion, and I think this is what Paul thought. It is your generosity, the generosity of others. But my provision comes from God. And these others who contribute are vessels. They're used by God for my provision. It's this pretty beautiful partnership between God and me, and God and donors, and me and donors. It's a very interesting and wonderful constellation of relationship. One of the issues of being dependent on outside contributing donations is, and would have been for Paul even more difficult, is some people never lose track of our partnership. And others, life is busy and they sometimes lose track. So that, and this is not like, man, I just, I wish they were more committed. No, it's not necessarily that. I do know this. I make considerable contributions to other missionaries, and I for about half of it, I have automatic coming out, what's it called? It's automatic out of my bank account to them. Well, hey, there was no such thing as automatic anything in the first century. Paul was really and truly his what gave him margins was financially either a almost overwhelming business of tent making, which if it were overwhelming, the income that was derived from that was cheating what he felt his real mission was. And so I don't think he let his tent making overwhelm that. So the greater margin would have been provided by the gifts and contributions of other churches and other individuals. This is not easy. Okay, and then another aspect of his way of life was he didn't just lounge around and wait for the whatever time the preaching was going to be, and then after the entourage has already set everything up, he steps onto the stage and lets it rip. No, this guy was apparently he was busy all the time. And I'm drawing conjecture on this, but apparently Paul didn't waste his energy. He was busy, but he was not busy for the sake of being busy, and he was not busy to prove that he was who he said he was. He was busy doing what God had ordained him, had set him apart for, had commissioned him to do. I want to be that. I want my lifestyle, my way of life, to be an encouragement and, if possible, an inspiration to others. Paul's was for Timothy. And then he said, my way of life, my purpose. What was his purpose? Well, in Philippians chapter 3, he says, I want to know Christ and to share in the fellowship of his suffering so that somehow I may obtain eternal life. And I'm thinking, that's a purpose statement. In Colossians, he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I that lives, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live, well, the point is, his purpose was God-centered. In Romans chapter 12, he talks about, this is deeply theological, where he says, for those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. Meaning, God knew who would say yes to him. He knew this beforehand. He also knew who would not say yes to him. But to those who said yes, he had a predetermined outcome. And it is that they would be conformed. They would be shaped. They would be in a process of becoming more and more like Jesus. I often work with clients who the idea of a mission statement is, they've never had time. Many of them have never been challenged with it. Know your purpose. We're going to come back to this because it's so important. So next time we're going to talk about what's your purpose. And I'll see you then on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.